I'm the head of Start Space at State Library Victoria, and I am going to be moderating this session for us this morning, our first session of the Future Founders Festival. So welcome everyone. I hope you've all had the opportunity during that break to check out Slido. That's your chance and the best place for you to ask questions. And we're very much encouraging questions to come through on these sessions. They'll be fed through to me and I'll be able to ask questions of our panel, or in this case, our prime speaker, Ivan Lim. Ivan, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Delighted to be here.
We are so pleased to have you. For those who don't know, Ivan was an international student himself coming to Australia and is well known now as the CEO and co-founder of Brossa, the furniture and homewares company, but has been the CEO and founder of previous companies before that, and so has had a really interesting business journey. So Ivan, maybe you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Brossa. We've been running Brossa now for about 6 years. I was an international student. I was born in the UK, but grew up in Brunei, which is in Southeast Asia. I came to Australia to do a foundational course, and then I continued through to the University of Melbourne. I did a Bachelor of Arts, Media Communications. My sort of career has kind of taken a few paths, and I'm sure we'll dive into it later. But most recently, probably over the last 10, the majority of my career has very much been in tech. I have always had a background in product, growth marketing. Worked in, I guess, marketplaces, software as a service, e-commerce businesses as well. And yeah, I think, back when I guess the startup ecosystem in Melbourne was very small. Some of you guys may know about Startup Victoria. I think Judy Anderson, who's the CEO, is speaking at the festival as well. Startup Vic used to be a meetup group of like 10 people who would meet in Inspire 9, which is a co-working space out of Richmond. And I used to pop in every now and then. Now it's a great organization that's helping entrepreneurs. So yeah, I think have had a bit of history in Melbourne, but always really passionate about the startup ecosystem, and also really passionate about international students and immigrants building great things here in Australia.
Thanks so much, Ivan. Yeah, I think we're both born in the same part of the world, actually, within a few miles away. I'm from Liverpool in the UK. So that journey to studying in Melbourne, how did you find that experience of arriving here, trying to work out the landscape, what was going on, trying to find those meetup groups? What did that kind of feel like back at the beginning?
Yeah, I think, so I left home at a very young age. I left home at about 13 years old. I went to Singapore to study. I think I've always been raised as an independent thinker. Very classical Asian sort of background, very driven, need to get the best possible results. And, I think I went to Singapore kind of very driven to kind of make the most of my academic career. Obviously, as a young kid, you just didn't really know what else you were going to do. Something happened pretty early on. I mean, my biological mother passed away when I was 14 years old, and that kind of shook me because I was very close to my mother. And I think, from that period, I kind of lost my bearings a little bit. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I think if my biological mother had her say, I'd probably be in the UK or the US studying. I wouldn't have come to Australia. But my sister came along, and she decided, she was in Singapore as well, and she decided she wanted to come here. And I, being a younger brother, I guess still not really knowing what I wanted to do, kind of followed her here to Melbourne. And to be honest, I think for a long period of time, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was doing a Bachelor of Arts, Media Communications. It was interesting, but I didn't really know whether that was what I wanted to pursue. But I think during that time, I kind of realized a few things. And I think, university was a very, very helpful time for me to kind of discover myself. I realized that, three things. I really enjoy taking complex, disparate sort of concepts and piecing them together into a framework that makes sense. And then I really enjoy communicating. So that's the second thing that I really enjoy doing. And the third thing I realized was I just really like starting things. I realized that whether that was in student organizations or in other sorts of things I was doing, I tended to be the person who would start stuff. And that just seemed to be natural. I got much more of a thrill out of it. And so, I think I've always kind of chased that sort of, place that allowed me to take a sort of role to be proactive and to build things. I think that's what kind of just naturally made me gravitate towards the startup ecosystem here in Melbourne. Yeah.
that sounds very much like a process of introspection, a process of working out what it was that drove you was pretty critical in working out where you were going to fit or what might be the right mix for you in the business journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think when you're younger, you're still trying to figure it out. And I'm definitely the first to put up my hand that I wasn't always put together or knew what I was trying to do. I was just trying to go with the flow, and you discover things, right? And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about how to think through those things. But concepts such as self-awareness and learning are just so critical, especially as we grow and coming into a new country as an immigrant. Everything is fresh, everything is new, and you're not only trying to discover yourself, you're also trying to discover this place, right? And so there's a lot of things flying you at one point, but that's okay. That's totally natural.
Yeah, I remember having an interesting experience of trying to work out GST and what was that and how did that framework work. And I had about 3 days to the project and just had no idea how it worked or how to get to grips with it. So it's a fast learning journey for the business journey anyway, as we can get to as we talk about your different businesses along the way. But I think for that extra element when you're haven't grown up in a particular culture, it can be there can be some unexpected surprises along the way.
Yeah, definitely.
So that process, then you ended up here. You went to uni and studied at the University of Melbourne. Was that it? Was that the light switch had gone on and you were like, right, business, here we go?
So my stepmother, she is a businesswoman, and she actually was the sort of genesis of Brosa, and I can talk about that later, how she did that. But she very much, I think, when we were growing up, as I was going through, I guess, secondary school in Singapore and so on, we used to have sessions where we would talk around the dinner table, and it wouldn't be like, oh, how was soccer practice or how was drama school? It was like, who's got a business idea and who's going to like save $100,000 to go buy a house, right? So that was like my upbringing that I went through. I think I generally had an affinity towards business, but I wasn't sure how exactly I would get into it. I came out with a media communications degree, really interested in political science, realized I probably didn't want to build a career there, but really like public relations and like the media sort of space. But I graduated during the GFC in 2008. And so there just weren't any jobs, right? And so nobody was really hiring anyone. And so my first job was actually as a telephone salesperson for IT equipment. And so if you're talking about like a hard job, like that's pretty hard. I mean, there's definitely harder jobs, but this was pretty tough. I was cold calling businesses, trying to sell laptops, printers, printer cartridges. I remember, it's my 21st birthday and I was 2 months into this job and I was talking to my dad and I was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing with my life. Like, why did I graduate from uni? And it just wasn't what I was passionate about, right? It's not to say that sales isn't great, but it's just really, really hard. And I had friends around me, and I remember my dad was telling me, it's just like, you should stick at it because there's something to be learned here. I think, you get your foot through the door and you're trying to pick up skills along the way. And I think, it made me realize quite a few different things, right? I think, on top of being a rude awakening, it really taught me a lot about hard work. Like it's really, really hard. You have to kind of grind through a lot of things. It taught me a lot about humility. It's not exactly the first sort of job that you come out and, while some of your friends are doing management consulting and so on, I was kind of like, I was doing this, it's just hard, right? But it taught me a lot about business, and that's really, really helpful. And I think, I learned a lot about sales cycles. I learned a lot about real marketing to drive sales, revenue, all those sorts of elements. So I kind of ran like a mini business within this business, right? And I think the thing that really helped me on my journey moving forward was that it showed me that I could self-teach myself a lot of things, and I could learn a lot of things through. I guess the internet was at a sort of stage where, so many things were online and people were reading blogs and, early days of Twitter. And we were just reading so many things online and realizing, oh, wow, there's this sort of technique. And then I would just apply it into my job and it would work, right? And so, I self-taught myself digital marketing. It gave me confidence to take those life skills and move it into other parts of, I guess, career progression outside of that. So somehow I hit all my sales targets for that 1 year, and then they promoted me into like a marketing role, and then I just kept going from there. But yeah, it definitely wasn't the smoothest start.
I've noticed that seems to be a bit of a theme in your career path, Ivan. That curiosity and working across a whole range of different subjects all at once. Because your first business was not a furniture business, was it?
No, it wasn't. My first business, Vinsby, we were a custom clothing men's business, right? And so the thesis that I had was buying clothes for men is really, really hard. And I think buying a suit or buying a shirt at the time, because I had to wear one every day, was just really, really painful. You needed to find something that fit you. And I thought, what if you could build a business where in the process of getting people a suit, you could give them a tailored sort of size and they put in their measurements. You could then hold their measurements and recommend a whole lot of other sort of clothing that would fit them, right? Very early stages of subscription commerce. There's now great businesses over in the States, for example, Stitch Fix, which is publicly listed. Their whole business is around kind of knowing your preferences, subscription commerce, and your measurements, which is very, very helpful. But yeah, I think I was just naturally driven by curiosity. I think we were talking a little bit before, and I think one of the questions that you had kind of marked down was like, what is the aha moment or things that have kind of driven me as a person? I think you're right. Curiosity is there. I think the core fundamental principle in my life, and I've learned this over time, is that I've tended to optimize my life for learning, to maximize learning and growth. I think it's just been very helpful for me as a guiding principle in my choices. I think, when given choices between money or prestige versus learning, I've tended to go down the path of learning. And whether it's working for myself, like when you work for yourself, you learn a lot just because you're just kind of at the coal face, right? But even when it came to like working with other businesses, like after Vinsby, that business, it became a nice cash flow business. It was interesting. But I wanted to learn more. I went and worked with Ned and PJ, who had started an online marketplace called Tweaky. They had been funded by Blackbird, which is a local venture capital fund here in Melbourne. They eventually sold that business to GoDaddy over in the States. I had their growth, but I wanted to work with them because I really wanted to learn from them, right? And even before my business, I was at OzHut, which is founded by Wai Hong. And Wai Hong is actually going to be talking at this festival as well. He's back in Malaysia. He's a good friend of mine. And because I just really wanted to learn, and I think that is a core sort of driving sort of philosophy. I think it's really hard sometimes to prioritize learning because you've just got all these other things that you're worried about, right? You're worried about like money, the pragmatic side of things. I think those are very, very valid things. I think what I've learned over time is that as a personal principle, I just try to live very simply. That doesn't mean I live in squalor, but it means that, it's a very conscious decision to make sure that my life isn't going to have, I guess, the overheads that will force me to sacrifice learning. And that is what drives me. And that's what drove me to Brossa. And that's what's driven me, even in my career progression now. I'm addicted to learning. And I like to make sure that I don't have to compromise that because of other reasons.
Yeah, and in that learning process, because you've founding a business, there's a lot going on. You're having to learn a lot in a lot of different areas. Quite often, maybe you're having to teach yourself little elements of tech so you understand enough to work with a tech co-founder or learn digital marketing or e-commerce. How have you approached getting that balance between being focused on what you need to learn right now to do your business and that general process of learning and taking things in?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think when it comes down to life, it comes down to business. I find that business is a very good analogy for life at times. Focus is everything. I think that you are just as much about what you don't do as what you do, right? And so what you say no to is really, really important. I think in the context of a business decision and what you're going to focus on and where you're going to spend your time, ultimately that's driven by the customer. I think I talk to lots of young entrepreneurs and they're kind of building businesses and they've got great ideas. And don't get me wrong, I think part of the joy of working with entrepreneurs is that they are creative people and they're driven people, right? But I think one of the things that's really hard for entrepreneurs is talking to customers sometimes because we're just afraid of rejection, right? We're kind of afraid like, oh, what if they don't like it? But I'm obsessive about talking to people about talk to your customers constantly, right? Like if you don't talk to your customers, you have no idea what they want and you could be building something that's completely irrelevant. And it's like you need product market fit. And I think once you do that, you then know what you need to focus on, right? Like, is it a particular feature that is tech enabled? Okay, great, right? Or could this actually be done by Google Sheets, right? I mean, to give you a context, Brossa, our whole supply chain software first started in Google Sheets. Like it was this hacked up Google Sheet thing where it's like if customers called in to find out where their order was, we literally would shout in the office and go, do not touch the Google Sheet. Somebody's editing the sheet and you just watch it live, somebody be filtering. It's like, do not edit. But I mean, that built the logic for kind of building the tech that we have, right? So
Yeah.
I think in business, you try and focus on what's most important, which is customers. To the second part of your question, Anna, like in terms of life, I think, I think you're driven by your passions. I think if you're naturally curious and you want to learn, you will kind of put yourself in situations to kind of learn more. And I intentionally try and carve out space to read, to learn, whether it's a practice of like waking up 30 minutes earlier and reading. I think that's very helpful, or spending time on the weekend. But I think learning is something that improves the quality of our thinking, and the quality of our output in life is influenced by the quality of our thinking.
Some fantastic advice in there. And I think that point about talking to your customers can't be overemphasized. I think there's a lot of fantastic ideas out there, but the question that we often hear from early stage entrepreneurs is, how do I know if my idea is a good idea? Is it going to work?
Yeah.
That process of talking to customers, did you find it, well, you were in sales, so you probably didn't find it that terrifying at first.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there is something sacred about a business idea not wanting that being crushed. Look, I mean, if I was actually going to go back to when we built Brosa, I would have said that we should talk more to customers. To give some context on why we started Brosa, I mean, Brosa, we're a direct-to-consumer furniture brand. We believe in creating beautiful homes effortlessly for our customers, and we do that through technology and deep vertical integration, because our belief is that buying furniture is incredibly hard. It's an incredibly high cognitive, high friction process, and we want to use technology to make that a seamless sort of process, right? Knowing that customer truth, I would say it took us 3 years to figure out. We didn't know that from the start. At first I thought like, oh, they just want a beautiful couch. It'd be fine. Like as long as we kind of sell a beautiful couch at a good price, that's fine. The selling is the easy bit, right? I actually realized over time that the process of delivering it, the process of getting it to a customer on time, because imagine like customer has to be home. They got to take time off work, or they got to be home. They don't know when the delivery driver's coming. The whole process of like figuring out, does this fit, does this not fit, assembly, removing, all those things are so difficult. And we didn't realize that, right? Like that's why we built our own delivery network. Like we now run trucks across Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. And why do we do that? It's just like, we need to do this because this actually solves the core customer problem. So it's a continuous journey. You don't do it once, you do it all the time. And we do it now as well.
So what does that look like for you? How do you send out surveys? Are you on the phone? Do you chat to customers? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we do some practical things. I think one is on a tactical level. We, for example, send Net Promoter Score surveys regularly to customers. Net Promoter Score surveys, look, they're going to give you a sort of pulse. They're not going to be very prescriptive at times, but they will definitely give you a pulse. But for example, we have an internal Slack or chat tool. Every single NPS survey from a customer actually goes into chat, and everybody in the company can see it, right? And so we can quickly identify, is there an issue? If there is an issue, like we're pinging each other going, we need to go and solve that. So I think there's some tactical things that you do. I think another thing that's very helpful is definitely every once in a while, like jumping on the phones or jumping into emails and actually seeing what's going on. And so, particularly, actually, I've actually gone through a stint in the last 4 weeks of actually diving into our customer service team platform and looking at tickets and going like, what are customers asking? So I think there's that. There's definitely like trying to be close to the customer and making that intentional. I think the other thing is just like doing things like surveys with customers, where we're building out a customer sort of panel that we spend time with. So I think the tactical things, and then finally, there's just cultural things, right? Like, as you build a company, you want to, I guess, enshrine a culture that is about serving the customer. Because at the end of the day, if people are just kind of like, well, I'm doing my job and the customer should just take whatever they get, you're not going to have a very customer-centric culture. So we talk a lot about delighting customers, and that's part of the, I guess, the language that we use regularly in the business.
Great, thank you. I hope there are some practical tips in there for people. We're starting to get questions come through on the Slido, so I might segue over to those so we can make sure that we answer as many of your questions out there in the audience as we possibly can while we have Ivan. So we've got a question come in around here during the festival is an opportunity to hear directly from founders more experienced or further down the journey. Are there other places? How do you get advice from people who've been there before? But that we get a lot of questions about how do I find a mentor? Is there a way that you've approached getting that advice from more experienced founders?
Yeah, I think this is great. I think getting advice is really, really important. And the fact that people are open-minded and willing to learn and genuinely trying to get advice from other people who may be able to get you further faster is just really, really critical, right? I think practical things are don't underestimate the willingness of people to actually help others, right? One thing that I've always been very passionate about is just how generous the startup community is. I came into the community not even knowing it was a community. I was just kind of doing this thing, and there's just only these people around, and they just seem to be willing to help and seem to spend time. And so I think there's very much a reciprocal sort of like we try to invest back into the community. But there's also things like, so I think you should reach out. You should definitely, ping people. It's really easy to reach out these days. I mean, LinkedIn, you can find people's emails, Twitter, all sorts of great places to reach out. I think if you're genuine and there's a really good reason why you think somebody can help you, and you should put thought into that, right? Like, not like, hey, just general sort of questions, but, people are time poor as well, but give them a really clear reason why you think they can help you. And try and make it as simple as possible. Like, I'll give you a call, 15 minutes, just want to ask you these specific questions. And it's really good. I think there are other things like Startup Victoria has, I think they've got an office hours thing where you can sign up and you can actually request time with basically founders or other people who can help give you advice. I know I'm part of that program. So, I've been speaking to some founders and so we chat through that. But you know what's the best way to actually learn? And this is my hack. The best way to learn is that if you don't have a specific business that you're working on right now, or you have some time to actually do other things, go work for people that you really like. Just go work for them because you will bring your skills, you will learn a lot of things through osmosis, and you will build a relationship and they will vouch for you to kind of go talk to other people and they will open their network up to you as well. So that's what I've done.
And that sense of networking, that terrifying, horrifying word, it's really just about having a strong sense of who's out there, what are they doing, and who's good at certain things that you can get in touch with. It seems like that sense of a strong network is something that you've nurtured over quite a number of years.
Yeah, I think it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to build a business, right? So I think that it's been very valuable to continue building great relationships with people in the ecosystem. I mean, one of the things that I've always done personally, and this is my own little thing, is I've actually got a little sheet of all the people who I haven't had a chance to work with yet that I really want to work with, right? And it's kind of like this almost cheat sheet for me where I'm like, oh, I need to talk to somebody about this thing. I'll go and speak to that person. And so I think that building great networks is great because you get advice, but it's also people you could hire into your business in the future, right? So for example, Anna Stockley, who is our chief operating officer, she used to be head of digital and marketing at Mecca. Mecca is a great business around makeup here, huge. I've known Anna for about 3-4 years before she joined us last year. And she was like at the very top of my list of people that I wanted to work with. But she was just a person that I got introduced to because one of the other fellow founders in the portfolio of Airtree Ventures, which is one of our investors, we all had like a breakfast thing. And he was just kind of like, hey, what's going on? I was like, oh, I'm thinking about this. And he's like, you should talk to Anna. Anna and I went to college together and she's come back. She spent time in New York. Like you should spend time with her. And so, I think having open conversations, spending time with people who you trust and respect is really important. I caveat all of this by networking doesn't mean spend endless amounts of hours at networking events, although we don't really have that many networking events at the moment. But going back to life at some point, if there are more in-person things, I think you got to pick and choose, right? You got to use your time wisely. I've always found having one-on-one sort of conversation has been the most helpful for me.
And we've had a question come in that you've sort of briefly touched on about, carving out space to read and to learn about work-life balance, and how you make those decisions. How do you optimize that so that your business doesn't take over your whole world? How you've got energy for yourself? And that might lead us into talking about maybe a little bit about risk and reward.
Yeah, sure. Great question. Look, to be frank, I don't think in the work-life balance sort of like matrix or paradigm. I think that work and life just kind of blends in together. I think, judging yourself on that sort of basis typically leads to some sort of sense of you're not doing enough. I think there is an element of just trying to be kind to yourself and just realizing that, when you're a founder, when you're an entrepreneur, there are times when it will flex that you're spending a lot of time working, right? And that happens because you're so passionate about what you're building and you don't feel burnt out or you don't feel like you're lacking on things because you're really, really passionate about that, right? So I think, don't feel like you have to work to some arbitrary, like, oh, it has to be like at least X number of hours or X% of your day. I think, I think what's really important is awareness of, where is your identity being built, and what is important at the end of the day. I think startups and building businesses are hard, right? The stats are the majority of businesses will fail. I look back and sometimes I wonder, like, how are we where we are right now? And the story isn't fully written on Brosa either. Like, we still got so many more challenges to go, and how are we where we are right now? And a lot of it is a combination of so many different sorts of factors, right? And so, what you soon realize is that while I can affect a lot of change, there's also a lot of things that could have turned against us, right? And so, I've gone on a journey where maybe in the early days, I was very much, I'm Ivan, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Brosa, right? And that was like what I identified with. I think over time, as I've, I guess, learned along the way, I've realized that actually I'm Ivan. I am the son to my parents. I am a brother to my sister. I am a partner to my girlfriend. I am a friend to my friends. I am a leader within my business. I'm a colleague to my co-founders and my people. But I am not just one thing. And I think that's when I reframed myself to think about my life as much more than just this thing that I do, and about all these other things actually, outside of work make me better in order to do my job better. That helped me carve out more time and be much more intentional. So that then led to some kind of semblance of work-life balance. But that's how I think about it.
That's great, thanks. That risk and that leads you into having to, you're constantly making those decisions around, and it goes back to that self-awareness point around what is the best fit for you personally. What are you willing to put on the line? What are you willing to, and what is important for you to get in return? Do you think about it like that consciously, about where you put your energies and what's important for you personally, personal success measures as well as success measures for Brosa?
Yeah. I think I think, like I said again, like focus is just really important, like what you choose to do and not. I think, as organizations grow, as your enterprise grows, you will have so many choices that you have to make. I typically think about things on a point of leverage, like I could do these 10 things. First of all, what's the most important? Okay, cool. And even then I'm thinking about, well, what thing could I do that gives me the most leverage for the amount of effort that I put in, right? And so, for me right now managing, I obviously have exec team members. I don't do as much of the doing anymore. But what I try to do is I go, well, if I spend time influencing this team member and trying to coach them through understanding how I think about stuff, then they then get imbued with that sense of thinking that I don't need to keep coaching them every single time, right? And so while it's a bit more upfront investment, but it's a very high leverage sort of activity, because in the future, they're just going to keep replicating stuff, right? And so I think, I think through things as high leverage, like, is this going to maximize leverage for me such that I can make maximum impact for the amount of time that is spent? I think there's definitely a risk reward thing. I think, there is a common sort of feeling that, entrepreneurs are very risky people. Look, I think there is an element of like we're happy to take a little bit more risk, but that's because many of us have kind of figured out the downside and gone, are we okay with that downside, right? And so, I always say that when it comes to being an entrepreneur, you seem like a crazy person until one day you're a genius, right? And so you're kind of ahead of the curve, because you kind of have an insight. You have an insight into what you think the world could be, what customers really want, or what a particular situation needs. And you're willing to kind of go, well, I figured out the downside, and I'm okay with that. And therefore, really, the rest of it is just opportunity cost, right? Like, once you go do it, right? So, I think there's definitely that sort of like inherent risk reward sort of nature that kind of goes through an entrepreneur. I think it's healthy. I think it's fine.
Mm. Starting to get questions coming in around that very early stage, that very beginning, where you have to make decisions about where you put your money, and where is the best place to put that, and what happens when you don't have a lot of capital, but you believe you need to. The question is asking about leasing a shop or building a robot. You don't have your product. It might take a little bit of outlay. How do you get going in those circumstances when you just don't have cash?
Yeah, great. So look, I think for the majority, big caveat, there are certain industries where capital is pretty important. I think, if you're going into deep tech, if you're going into certain sort of industries like hardware or so on, where there is a very big manufacturing component, capital does play a very powerful role, because it's almost like you need a certain amount before you can actually start playing meaningfully. Having said that, I generally, almost 95% of the time when I talk to founders, capital is not a constraint. Like cash is not a constraint, right? Like if you think about what you need to do to get to the next stage of your business, capital sounds like it would help, but it's really like an easy get out of jail free card. Like actually, most of the time it's like, well, okay, you're thinking about, well, I need money to market my business. I'm like, do you really? Like, are there free channels that you could actually go to? Like, or could you actually try and like maybe call some of them or get them to recommend other things, right? If you're like, oh, I kind of need this to do a proof of concept. I'm like, well, you're kind of thinking about A to Z, and Z is kind of like this proof of concept. I'm like, well, why don't you just break it down and go, okay, well, could you potentially get from A to B or A to C and prove certain elements before you get to Z? And you don't need capital to do that, right? And maybe once you kind of do proof of concept, then you can kind of go, okay, great, like I can now go out and raise capital or get funding from customers who will kind of buy ahead and go like, oh, cool, proof of concept is that I'm going to buy ahead. You could do a Kickstarter, all these sorts of things, right? And I mean, entrepreneurs are very resourceful, right? And I typically try and encourage entrepreneurs to go lean into that. That is your superpower, right? Like be resourceful, be gritty, hustle, because you're willing to kind of be creative, think outside the box that most of the population would just stop, right? And so capital is typically not the constraint.
I think that's really great advice. I think being focused, understanding your customer, knowing where you're trying to get and keeping it as simple as possible for as long as you can. I think your Google Sheets example was a good example of that. You didn't buy an off-the-shelf CRM, you ran it through the cheapest way possible.
I mean, we had a thesis that, off-the-shelf tech wasn't going to do what we wanted to do. We wanted to build, we knew, for example, like if you go into a furniture store, typically, people don't realize you walk into a Niscali, you walk into others, there is an 8 to 13 week lead time in order to purchase product, right? And so, it takes time for it to arrive to you. When you buy that, and this happened to me because I went furniture shopping. I bought my own place. I brought my mother around. My mother's an interior designer. She walked through the house and she went, Ivan, I love you. You're not allowed to go to IKEA. I was just like, what do you mean I can't go to IKEA? She's like, we're going to go down to Church Street and we're going to go buy furniture, right? And I was like, okay, cool. I thought, when we were buying stuff, I was just like, oh, we'd get it tomorrow. It actually doesn't come tomorrow. It takes time, right? And the worst part is that they take your money and they don't tell you anything about it. Like if you want an update, like you need to call them, like it's this black box, right? And so when we looked at more and more of the software, we actually realized that all of it is just super antiquated. Building furniture is complex. We work directly with makers in China, India, Vietnam, Australia. And so we just saw how complicated this whole process was. And we just went, what is the core customer truth? Customers want transparency. They want ease of information, and they want the ability to kind of access that on demand whenever they want. So we started building our sort of supply chain software from the ground up using the Google Sheets sort of logic. But we built it such in a way that we would be able to give customers that level of transparency, right? So I think we didn't try and set out and build that software from the ground up. We were just kind of like, we sat down literally in a room at the University of Melbourne. I remember me, David, and Richard, and we just kind of whiteboarded with what is the logic, what do we need to do, what could we build this in instead of trying to build the software? Because the worst thing is you got to build something and it's absolutely the wrong thing. Like time is like a commodity you cannot get back.
So you just said we there. You mentioned David and Richard. So you're not the sole founder of Brossa. You have co-founders, and there are many different ways of running businesses, from sole founders, co-founders. There are different models, and you've tried sole founder, and you're now very much in a co-founder relationship. So how does that differ?
Yeah, look, I mean, starting a business is really hard. It is a lonely journey. It can be. It doesn't have to be. It can be, and it's there's a lot of stress, right? I think you're constantly thinking about how you're going to get to the next sort of stage. It can feel lonely because people can't really relate to that founder experience, and that is part of what makes a founder special, because your obsession kind of drives you to find out the right sort of answer, and you push further than most people would. But it also has a mental toll, an emotional toll, a psychological toll. And I realized through my first venture that I'm not built to be a solo founder. That's just not in my DNA. Some founders are great and they can just kind of push on, and they're just like, I'm very, very single-minded, or whatever the sort of traits that they have which make them successful. That I don't know, because I'm not that. But I think co-founders, look, it is a relationship you have to manage, right? It's like getting married. Like you need to figure out, it's a commitment, and you need to figure out what the right ways to kind of manage that relationship. I think being really honest and open in your conversation with each other is really helpful. I think, we do founder feedback. So Richard, one of our co-founders, he's not day-to-day in the business anymore, but David is still day-to-day in the business. And so, we have every quarter we do a founder feedback session, right? And we just kind of go down and be like, what are some strengths, what are some weaknesses, what are areas to improve? And we're very blunt and we're very honest. And I've always said, look, I'd rather you be upfront, because there is this understanding that we're not doing it to hurt each other. We're just trying to get the best possible result. So, I think that going in with good intentions, but being honest and being focused is really important. And I think, maybe a tip for co-founders as your thing kind of grows as well, is that over time you kind of realize that your roles start to become quite different, right? Like I'm the CEO, David's not the CEO, but he's in charge of product and tech, right? And so he drives a lot of that, and he has a different sort of mandate. Whereas me as a CEO, I have a different sort of mandate, right? And so you realize that while there's certain things that kind of bring you together and you talk on, you also have different roles, and you need to do those roles for the success of the company. Yeah.
And does that get tricky along the way?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, it's always tricky, right? I think it's a tightrope that you need to balance all the time. It's definitely not rosy all the time. Like David and I have disagreements all the time. It doesn't mean that we lose respect for each other. But I have a lot of respect for David. He's one of the strongest founders I've ever met, and I would build multiple businesses with David. But I think it can be challenging, right? Like as in, you have different points of view. People really care, but you try and focus on the fact that people care, right? And the fact is that we're engaged, we're still involved, we're still passionate about what we're building, and that's why we're trying to find the right answer. But I think there's also an element of like needing to commit together, not kind of holding out to go, it's my way or the highway. There is an Amazon sort of concept which they have in their management team, which is to disagree but commit. And so you can hash things out, you can bring your own perspectives. You may disagree, but once the leader or whoever's leading that project, or the team commits, it's like you need to buy in and you need to commit alongside your team as well, because. I remember reading one of the pieces, like one of the early sort of execs at Amazon, he was not a believer in the Kindle, right? He was like, I don't think this is going to work. And he disagreed. But once the team committed, he was like, I'm so glad I committed, because I went along the journey and I felt that it was really, really important that this is the decision the business going in. I'm going to throw everything I can to make it as successful as possible, right? And lo and behold, here we are.
I think we're coming to the end of our time with you, Ivan. So there's just a couple more minutes if you want to drop your questions into the Slido to see if we can sneak those in. We did have a question about the way that our current environment, and particularly given COVID, means that there's a lot more online shopping happening. There's a lot of changes in e-commerce and the online shopping platforms. Have the changes in e-commerce and distribution in particular, have you had to change your online business model to respond to the way that e-commerce is developing?
Not particularly. I think, this is, we've been fortunate enough that our business model was built for this. The way that I think about COVID right now, and this is something that's on the mind of a lot of entrepreneurs, right? Like, how should we think about the current world that we live in? My thesis on the world, on COVID right now, is that this is the great acceleration. This isn't as much of a, hey, now things are completely different. This is, and things that we never knew were happening with something happening. This is just an acceleration of everything that was already happening. It's just happening in 5-10 years, right? Like the movement towards telehealth, the movement towards online education, right? The movement towards more directly accessible sort of commerce that you didn't need to physically go out and make purchases all the time. So, I think that has meant that, we've been able to leap 5 or 10 years ahead, and just kind of like the future has just been kind of pulled forward, right? So I think you've seen that in many industries where the tech businesses are just thriving, because that's kind of like the beauty of tech, is that we're typically thinking a couple of years ahead, right? And so that's been helpful. But I think at the same time, for entrepreneurs starting out and doing, you should be encouraged. Innovation happens in every season. Right? Even in the greatest recessions, I mean, some of the most iconic businesses that have been built started off in a recession period, right? And so, innovation never stops, right? And periods like this are even more ripe for innovation, because things have moved. There are now, I mean, if you think about the market, it's like, there's a stable state, and then something comes in and disrupts, and suddenly the tectonic plates just start moving, right? And then there's just these gaps that start happening. It's like those gaps are opportunities, and innovation never stops.
I think that's a very strong and very hopeful note for us to draw this session to a conclusion on, that now can be as good a time as any to set up a business and to get motoring with that idea and just start. So Ivan Lim, thank you so much for your time.